Looking at our last session of the day, we have the fortune of having one of our own present to us, Peter O'Reilly, the CFO of Red Bank Borough, talking about the costing out the productivity and wages. Looks like a comparison of public sector wages to private sector, and what value we get from our employees. I might be completely off, but the description looks very interesting to me, and looks like a good way to end the afternoon. So I will turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry, and thank you everybody for attending this last workshop talk of the day. Yeah, I'm sure you're all looking forward to the virtual happy hour. I know I will be. But all kidding aside, yeah, thank you for attending. Thank you for the GFOA for giving me this opportunity to speak to you today about a topic that I think is very important to us, or will be very important to us, and even more so in this age of the pandemic. And first of all, I want to apologize to everybody for having disease in the title. I assure you that when I presented this idea to the GFOA, it was late January, February, well before the pandemic broke out. And I will assure you that as much as there's disease in the title, it will not negatively affect anyone's health, and that it is a good thing. So with that, I have a lot to present today. I'm going to try and move very quickly. And with that, let's get started. And so just a little bit about myself. As Jerry gave a nice introduction, by day I work as a municipal CFO, and by night I am a economics junkie. I love learning about how our economy works. And maybe I have a glutton for punishment, but I tend to read a lot of academic papers on the subject. I've been a subscriber to the National Bureau of Economic Research for the better part of a couple decades now. And yeah, I just find that the economy, how it works or how we think it works, to be very fascinating, and more so for topics that affect me personally, as well as my financial portfolio, and as well as the work that I do, to be of great interest. And it's that last item that I want to talk to you today about a particular topic, obviously that being cost disease in local government. And so with that, I'll explain to you how it's relevant to the work that we do, in particular with budgeting. And I know this has been a very challenging year for us with our budget process. I know for my borough, we adopted later than usual back in August. And I actually had a public comment, I remember, during our budget adoption process, where a former employee mentioned in the public comments section, and this woman, a very kind woman, said, "Oh, you can easily slash 10% across the board for every department." Now, I'm sure you know why that may be a little misguided as a financial officer, and I'm sure you can explain from an operational standpoint with very specific details and figures why that would be maybe not in the best interest of your municipality or whatever local government you work for. Today, I'm going to present something that gives you a more broad view, holistic view, in plain speak, a macroeconomic view of why it is that you simply cannot slash your budget or cut government spending significantly. Of course, it goes without saying that as financial officers, we try our best to reduce costs, find efficiencies, reduce waste, improve our productivity, right, and try to pass on as much savings to the taxpayer. But you know, sometimes there's some greater powers or headwinds that are presented to us, one of them being cost disease that I'm going to introduce to you very shortly. However, even though I'm referring to something as a disease, that's not a term that I came up with. Unlike disease that you would think in the natural world, like in medical terminology, this disease actually has some discrete benefits, and in particular for us as government finance officers, as well as for the operation that we oversee. And I'll go into detail about that later in the presentation. But first, I have to give you some more background on Cost disease. And with that, I'm going to ask for just a little bit of patience, because this explanation is going to seem very counterintuitive to you at first. But I promise you, as I move through the slides, it'll become clearer to you. It's also very research driven, and specifically with an economic focus. I'm going to avoid making political or social commentary. And with that, I'm going to focus on how things are versus how things should be. Naturally, we would all desire to have lower taxes, of course, but what I'm really going to speak to is how things are. And in economic speak, I'm going to make normative statements, if you will. And the one unusual thing about cost disease is, in terms of consensus among economists, economists tend to disagree on a lot of things. There's very few things that they do tend to agree over the course of time. One of them that seems to have grown in acceptance is, in fact, cost disease. And this growing acceptance has spanned over the course of many decades. And with that, I'd like to get started and introduce you to the founder of cost disease, that being the late William Baumol. He was an American economist that passed away in 2017. He lived to a very ripe old age of 95. And as you can see on the screen, he had a very distinguished career as a US Army vet, but also as a long-standing professor at NYU and Princeton universities. If that's not remarkable enough, he also authored 80 books, which I find absolutely incredible, given how much effort it takes to even just write a single book. And he's also published hundreds of journal articles. Was a very prolific author, that's for sure. And he was also considered for the Nobel Prize on a couple of occasions. Unfortunately, came up a little bit short, but he certainly left a lasting legacy within the field of economics and very influential with policymakers. So just to serve up a appetizer here, if you will, to wet our whistle, one of his hundreds of papers that he wrote, Baumol, back in 2012, he made a prediction, a rather bold prediction, whereby he stated that by the turn of this century, 2105, to be more specific, 6 out of every $10 circulating in the economy would be applied to healthcare expenditures. Now, if you think about that on the surface, that is quite alarming to think by the turn of next century, 60% of our economy will consist of healthcare, and only healthcare. However, you have to keep in mind that his prediction assumed a rate of growth of only 1.4%. And notably, over the course of time, over an extended length of time, thanks to the power of compounding, that rate of growth is significantly less than the rate of growth of the economy, and also that of the historical rate of inflation. So I'm going to come back to that 60% prediction later in the presentation and see how it also applies to local government as well. So the late Baumol had a lot to say about municipal government. In a published journal article back in 1967, I'm not going to read you the entire quote, but I'll emphasize the text in blue. He wrote, "Municipal budgets will almost certainly continue to mount in the future. There's a trend for which there's nothing that could be done to stop it." Now, I would safely argue, or at least I think safely argue, that those comments written in 1967 are just as profound and equally true as they are today. And I would say continue to be in at least the near future. So with Baumol's cost disease, why should we care about it? Well, for one, it's a powerful tool for understanding the modern economic world. And it's also been very influential to many generations of economists and policymakers. Policymakers for sure at the national, international level, however, maybe not so well known at the state and local government level. And hence the reason for me wanting to give you this presentation today. And I must mention that his research started out in the 1960s and it's just continued to grow in acceptance since that time. So to understand productivity, understand cost disease rather, we have to understand productivity. Productivity is at the heart of cost disease. And fortunately for a bunch of financial professionals that are comfortable with numbers and basic mathematics, this is a very, very easy concept to master. So easy to master. This is in fact, the economic definition of productivity. It's one whereby it measures output per unit of input. And quite simply, as an example, it could be how many widgets a factory worker will produce in say a day or in a week or in a year, or how many widgets a salesperson will sell within a given unit of time, whether that be a day, a week, or a year, of course. And so why do we care about productivity? Well, productivity is tied to wage growth. The more productive you are, the more your wage will grow, not only at an individual level, but at a much broader level. So, I mean, obviously, I'm stating something that may seem very obvious to you. The more widgets you sell within a given amount of time, the more you will earn in sales commission. The more widgets you produce on the factory floor, within a given unit of time, of course, your employer will hopefully reward you with that increased productivity and give you a nice pay raise. So back in the 1960s, William Baumol demonstrated cost disease in a publication whereby he focused on the performing arts industry. And within that writing, he used a Beethoven string quartet as an example, and whereby he noted that it requires the same number of musicians to play string quartet today as it did back in the 19th century. And of course, you don't play that music as originally composed any faster or any slower than as Beethoven had originally composed, and therefore you're not changing productivity over that time. However, musicians performing that piece will certainly be compensated much more today than they are back in the 19th century. Now, for many of you, that may seem painfully obvious, but I want to present to you a hypothetical example that will drive this home more and raise a question to you. So here we have an example of change in productivity for someone working on the factory floor producing widgets. And as you can see, over the course of 10 years' time, their productivity increased by a measure of 50%. They produced 100,000 more widgets in 2020 rather, than they did in 2010. You can attribute that to maybe better training, better lighting, improvements in plant and equipment, and so forth. Obviously, that person working in the widget industry is working in a very productive industry, and I'll have more to say about that in a moment. If we compare that to a non-productive industry, if you will, that being tax collection, and by no means am I picking on tax collectors here. I just wanted to use an example at the local government level, and measuring productivity of a tax collector is pretty easy to do in terms of how many line items or billable accounts they are responsible for. So as you can see in this example, the tax collector's number of line items hasn't changed over the course of time. However, their wage has certainly increased over time, even though they didn't increase their productivity. Now, naturally, I don't know of any tax collector that would want to stay in a position for 10 years without a single pay raise. And the reason that tax collector is given a pay raise or many pay raises is the following. So we have to talk about stagnant productivity, i.e. the example of the tax collector, where they're not servicing more line items over time. Some industries outpace others, that's a given, but employers that conduct their operations in a stagnant industry must increase their wages and must do so over the course of time and do so at a rate that's greater than inflation or the cost of living, of course. Otherwise, those employees will leave. An example I presented, the tax collector may decide, hey, if I'm not keeping up with the cost of living, I might as well seek to maybe become a musician or maybe a widget worker, right? So naturally, over time, prices will rise, reflecting the passing on of those increased wages, and with that, cost disease will prevail. And so with cost disease, it is most virulent for industries that are difficult to automate and standardize, and definitely for ones that require a lot of human interaction, such as local government. And so I mentioned before that cost disease has had great acceptance among economists and policymakers. I tried high and low to find real counter arguments or counterpoints to that economic theory, if you will. And the best that I can come up with is from the Cato Institute, a libertarian think tank organization and a very respected one. But truthfully, their counterpoints never really stuck or held much weight, and that being innovation and privatization counterpoints. And I think you'll see in a moment why that is true, or at least I believe to be safely true. So with innovation, I want to compare an industry that's highly innovative, a private sector industry, and I'll compare that with a private sector industry, if you will. An example I present to you now is with General Motors. And as you can see, over the course of time, it requires fewer and fewer hours to produce a car from start to finish. Now, the reason for that, for many of you, I would think is pretty obvious, right? They're investing a whole lot more in plant and equipment, automating processes, advanced robotics, and what have you. And then we come to government or local governments and think about innovation. And this, I gave some thought about how innovation occurs within our space, if you will. And this is more of opinion than fact, I would say, but maybe agreeable to many of you. I would say the biggest boon to innovation in my memory was moving from ledger paper to the computer spreadsheet. Certainly a great boost to productivity, for sure. And then I tried to think of another innovative measure. And the best example, next best example I can come up with, not nearly as great as ledger paper to computer spreadsheet, is moving from paper-based banking to online banking. And so I did a little more thinking and tried to think out of the box and look to the future and say, hey, what can I imagine as being another really big boost to innovation, or innovative boost and a boost to productivity? And the one thought that I had in mind, maybe it's wishful thinking, but I'm kind of optimistic about this, is having our financial accounting software integrates and automates, have some level of automation with state reporting. So the example I would give you is those who work in MSI or Edmunds, you would do predominantly most of your work, and I do mean predominantly most of your work within that software package. And then when it comes time to publish your AFS or report on your AFS to the state or even your budget, you would press a button, and via web service over the World Wide Web, it would push that information out to the state DLGS's web service, and then consumed by its database software, and then quite possibly you would sign into FAST and you see all of your information all filed and ready to go. Perhaps maybe have to make a tweak or two, but the point being is things would be greatly automated and greatly integrated. Conversely, the state may be able to push information out to you, like your cap bank balances. They would automatically be imported into your MSI or Edmunds software. The bid threshold that increases every 5 years. Instead of having to hunt and peck for those settings, you would find them automatically appearing within your software program. The example I would use is those who are accustomed to filing your income taxes each year. Perhaps many of you who do are using a software package like Intuit TurboTax or H&R software. That would be a tremendous boon to productivity, in my opinion, and hopefully one that will come sooner than later. I'm optimistic it will happen, but I'm hoping that it will get more and more traction over time. So I'd like to focus next on what it is that government does well. Now, by no means is this a complete list. This is just a few ideas I have. Parks and Rec, policing, firefighting, and schooling or education. And of course, at the center of all that activity that helps make that happen is the CFO or the school business administrator, if you will, that moves the money in and out for those activities. And so the argument is, well, why don't we increase productivity? Well, when you think about it, do we really want to increase productivity? I mean, in the case of a police officer, do you want them writing a traffic ticket for every possible infraction? Or do you want to replace police officers walking the beat with traffic cameras, whether they be red light cameras or speeding cameras? I think a lot of New Jersey residents had a big note to that not too long ago. Likewise for firefighting. Do you want to, in an economic sense, or by economic definition, have fewer firefighters putting out more fires? Well, that would be more productive. However, it's painfully obvious that wouldn't be in the public's interest. It wouldn't be a safe measure. Likewise, for schooling, do you want to double the size of the classroom, have twice as many students being taught by a teacher? Probably not. So with all this commentary, it leads to this gentleman, the late US Senator from New York, Daniel Patrick Moynihan. I believe he passed on in 2003. Not only was he a senator, he was also an advisor to President Nixon, and he was also a close friend of William Baumol. He had this comment that has really stuck with economists and policymakers, and obviously that was before his passing, almost or more than 20 years ago. He stated that activities with cost disease migrate to the public sector. So before I mentioned about innovation possibly being a cure and then maybe privatization. Well, I know I'm going to be preaching to the choir here about privatization, so I don't think I need to go into great detail why, well, at least in my opinion, that isn't a great idea. However, I will provide you with a little bit of historical context, demonstrating how things have, in fact, moved to the public sector and have done so at the local government level. So the first example is with policing. And at one time, it used to be a for-profit, privately funded operation, and police officers weren't known as police officers. Instead, they were known as night watch officers. And they typically worked doing public safety work, if you will, that was kind of unsavory, and work that was considered kind of a punishment to be assigned such duty and not be paid for it as a volunteer. So it wasn't until 1838 that this country had its first publicly funded municipal police force, and that would be in Boston, Massachusetts. Now we have firefighting. At one time, firefighting was a private enterprise. It was one largely driven by the needs of private insurance companies to protect their business. They would hire or compensate private fire brigades to go out and rush to put out fires. And the one notable thing about firefighting is that back at that time, if you didn't have insurance, you were out of luck. You had no protection. And it wasn't until 1853 that we had the first municipal fire department, and that was in Cincinnati, Ohio. Likewise, for public education came about much earlier in this country, actually before it was a country, back in the mid-1600s. However, it wasn't until the 1930s that it really took foothold in this country, whereby it became entrenched nationwide or widespread and funded mostly by property taxes. So the examples I gave you with policing, firefighting, and public education, definitely public services that were once private services. And so I want to take a closer look at municipal operations, since I'm a municipal CFO, and I did a little research of my own. And I took a walk up to the municipal clerk's office at Red Bank, and in fact walked into a vault, truly a vault, and had a field day rummaging through boxes of papers and books and some very fancy leather spiral bound books. And I uncovered an artifact like this one up on the screen. As you can see, it's the municipal budget back from 1913. I think it's pretty cool. Unfortunately, for what I want to demonstrate to you, it doesn't have enough detail, but I just thought it'd be nice to show that as a brief distraction. However, I did find a budget that had much more detail and sufficient detail, going back as early as 1957 with the Red Bank municipal budget. And the interesting thing about the budget back then is its budget format very much resembles the budget format that we know and work with today, which to me I find pretty extraordinary. And so with this exercise with the budget, I wanted to break down the budget, and I did exactly that. And I broke it down into two basic categories, that being labor and capital. And I'll explain the reason for that. First, I want you to take your public accounting hat off and put your private accounting hat on. And I want you to think of capital as being working capital, or capital that supports operations. In this case, I took the 1957 municipal budget. At that time, Red Bank had obviously a current fund as well as a water utility fund. And I collectively took the salary and wages and the payroll taxes for both the current and water utility operating fund, and as well as pension and healthcare. At this point, honestly, I don't remember if that exists or not, but anything that was applicable to wages, salary and wages, I enumerated that. And took that total and backed it out of the total appropriation amount for the current fund and the utility fund. And I came up with this 50-50 split. So why did I go through this exercise? Well, thinking as an economist and talking about productivity, right? When I mentioned the definition about productivity, productivity has a measure of input as well as output. Well, economists like to think of inputs in two basic categories, that being labor and capital. In fact, they call it the basic inputs for total factor productivity, if you will. And so I wanted to see how this changed over the course of time, if at all. And I moved to the current year budget, and I performed the same exercise. Here I have documented a little bit better, whereby I tallied up salary and wages, both regular wages and overtime, pension appropriation, health insurance benefits paid by the employer, as well as payroll taxes and any other ancillary benefits. And then I deducted that from the total appropriations. In the case of Red Bank, not only do we have a water utility now, we also have a parking utility. So I added up the three funds, including the current fund, and I came up with this split, which is essentially unchanged over the course of, 63 years or so. So why is this significant? Well, economists that track productivity and industry productivity, especially for private industry in a very competitive environment, over the course of time, you will see greater investment in capital, or a shift away from labor to capital. And obviously that hasn't occurred here, as I demonstrated at the municipal level. I'm sure if you perform the same exercise with your municipal or county or local authority budget, you would come up with similar results. Peter, and as I mentioned earlier, productivity isn't the be-all, end-all, especially for local government. It's not the best, not always in the best interest to improve productivity, at least from an economic perspective.
Peter, can we break for here we go, for a poll. Let's get the poll question done. Does this workshop end at 5:30? Is she giving you a hint, Peter? The presentation's been great so far. I'm just, while they're doing the poll, my observation from 1957 budget is the same as format it is today. I believe it actually goes back to the 30s where it hasn't changed. And that might be part of the hindrance in effectively automating the process. While we try to make the process fit what we've done for the last 100 years, it has to be changes on both sides. So, by the way, I know Cindy Lindsay's on this here. I checked the roster, so I'm not talking. I feel for everyone up there. I've tried and failed, so I don't want to, and I've tried and failed for the same reasons. We need to be. We need to address change on both ends and in every way we can in order to make that change effective. But all right, so I'll get off my podium, off my soapbox. The poll is done, and let's get back to the presentation.
Thank you, Jerry, for those comments. All right, I'm going to steamroll along here, and I'm coming into the final stretch, which is a good thing. So I talked about government, and in particular local government. Now I have to talk about it in the context of the U.S. economy as a whole. And for those, many of you who are very aware, how we measure economic output is a measure called GDP. What may not be obvious to many is how GDP is actually calculated, or what goes into GDP. And up on the screen, you see is the secret sauce. It's basically a component of four factors, or sum of four components. And those components are C, or personal consumption, G, government spending, I for investment, and NX for net exports. And for a talk on cost disease, we can put aside the I and the NX, and I just want us to focus on the C and the G. And the reason for that is, if I can go to the next slide. Thank you. So here I have a tail of the tape. I broke out how the economy looks proportionally among those four components. And as you see, the biggest slice of the pie, if you will, is C, or personal consumption. And you can think of personal consumption being practically everything you as an individual or as a household will spend, whether it be rent, your mortgage, food, transportation, entertainment, clothing, insurance, you name it. The other thing I want you to take away from this pie chart is the next largest component of the US economy, and it is a distant second, is government. And what I mean by government, I'm lumping together federal, state, and local governments, not only with spending, but also investment. If I fast forward to 2020, you will see that little has changed with personal consumption and government. Truly, the only thing that really significantly changed from 1947 to year 2020 is NX, or net exports, meaning that's the difference between how much we export and import. And quite honestly, I don't know how to represent that in a pie chart because NX is now negative, meaning that we import more than we export. That's a little aside. The takeaway that I want to share with you with the pie charts is that far and large, the biggest component of our economy is on personal consumption. And so why do I mention personal consumption? What's the importance of that? And with respect to cost disease? Well, if you see on this next slide, I have a table that's reported by the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, and you will see over the course of time, things that we spend money on have become, or many things that we spend money on have become less and less expensive over time. In fact, from 1986 to 2010, whether it be food, housing, or transportation. However, one thing has significantly gone up, and no surprise to us who put budgets together, that being healthcare as well as pension related. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move to the next slide here. I think it's easier to digest this price information, if you will, with a line chart. Here I'm showing the consumer price index that tracks the change in prices for various goods and services. As you can see, there's quite a dramatic change for some items and not a dramatic change for others over the course of many years, spanning from 1978 to 2018. What you do see is college tuition, to no surprise, increase almost 14-fold over that time, as well as Medicare being a big increase over that time. However, things like clothing, new vehicles, which I'll have more to say in a moment, and transportation and food, those have not really increased appreciably over time. So you couple that thought with the biggest slice of the economy being personal consumption, most of the things that we spend our money on have become more affordable over time. And to give you a specific example, I'll use a big ticket item, that being purchasing a car. As you see on this slide, that affordability increased greatly over time for the average American worker. For example, back in 1908, you had to work on average 4,700 hours to be able to afford a car. Fast forward 100 years later, and it's roughly, it's less than 1,400 hours that the average American has to work to afford a mid-price car. So that's a pretty dramatic drop in a big personal budget item, or a big household purchase item. So with that, disease produces its own cure. What I mean by that is, of course, things don't stand still. The economy grows, and it grows, for all argument's sake, at a natural rate of 2% per year. And by the power of compound or compound interest, if you will, over a course of 100 years, it will result in an 8 times increase in the size of the economy. So as the economy is growing over time and things are becoming more affordable in a personal consumption space, well, things that are very dear, whether it be healthcare, as Baumol illustrated back in 2012 with his prediction of 60% of the US economy at the turn of the century, or local government becoming more costly, it'll still be affordable for most Americans. And I just have a couple more slides, I promise. We talked about the US economy and the components of GDP. There's one interesting trend, specifically with government expenditure and investments. As you see, comparing 1947 and progressing to the present time, the latest available data back in the second quarter of this year, you'll see a shift from an emphasis on federal government to state and local. And in fact, it's a pretty dramatic shift over time. Something that hasn't gotten much press or attention. I guess it's kind of like, instead of a big storm, it's kind of like the fog that kind of slowly creeps in over time. And the nice thing with this, with having a greater emphasis on state and local governments, most definitely a good thing is it serves up well for a good employment outlook, in particular for those who work in the field of local government finance. In fact, if you consult the US Department of Labor's occupational web portal, I highly recommend it, ONET, you will see whereby in their words, it's a bright outlook for certain occupations, including government finance occupations, that being accountants, auditors, and assessors, and an even rosier outlook for financial managers, including public financial managers that would also include like CFOs and treasurers. So with that greater demand for local government services, you can see that translates into a brighter outlook for employment prospects for us. And that's over the long haul. And so with this, I just want to wrap things up. To summarize, we covered a lot of ground about cost disease, where there's nothing that can be done to stop it, and it's something that migrates to the public sector. The US economy, it's largely consumer-based with decreasing prices or more affordability for most goods and services purchased by the public. And that leaves more money available and greater demand for non-productive goods and services that kind of shift and migrate towards the public sector. And with that greater demand for such public sector goods and services, that provides a bright outlook for employment, and in particular for those who work in government finance. And with that, that concludes my presentation. And I just would like to thank everyone for listening in, and the GFO for giving me an opportunity to speak. I also wrote this fantastic book that goes into more detail about productivity, as well as it covers all of the financial management courses taught at Rutgers and a whole lot more. It also makes an excellent desktop reference because I have a lot of reference information in there. And I do hope that you give an opportunity to check that out. And I'll be happy to stick around and answer any questions. And if you don't want to ask here in the virtual space, I'm more than happy to respond to your questions or even feedback at my email address that's located at the bottom of the screen.
Definitely want to check that out, the book. Presentation was awesome. Health insurance, for example, I'm remembering when a family plan was $8,000. It's now mid-30s. So that just proves I'm as old as my grandfather was when I was listening to him in high school. So anyway, thank you very much. Great presentation. Really appreciate it. Very informative. For the group, we all just got an email that the presentations from the 23rd, yesterday, that's today, right? Yesterday's presentations are on the website under events-photo gallery. So I thank John Donadio and particularly his staff for getting that up very promptly. And I'm sure we'll be able to see today's in the near future. So if you're looking for the slides or presentations, it's all been recorded. And I guess we're ready to go for the, oh, no, we got a question. Bill Homa thanks us and appreciates the great sessions we've had today. So, all right, we will see everybody bright and early tomorrow morning for a new session. A lot easier to get up for these with the virtual. I guess that's one advantage of not live, but hopefully next year we go live. Thanks again, Peter.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody.
Take care.